Hello and welcome. My name is Aaron Stein, Director of the Middle East Program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia, and you are listening to the Middle East Brief, a podcast focused on developments in the Middle East and why they matter for U.S. foreign policy. Be sure to subscribe to the Middle East Brief on iTunes and Spotify, and sign up to receive FPRI's Weekly Insights newsletter, where a link to the show will be delivered every 2 weeks straight to your inbox at www.fpri.org. Hello and welcome. Today we're talking to Dr. Josh Krasna, an FPRI Senior Fellow and also an Adjunct Assistant Professor at the NYU Center for Global Affairs. Josh, it's good to have you on the show.
Thank you. It's very good to be back with FPRI.
Absolutely. So last Thursday, we're recording this on Tuesday, July 30th, so July 25th, was the 25th anniversary of the Washington Declaration, where Israel and Jordan announced the end of the state of war between the two countries. You know, Josh, given your expertise and your long career dealing with these issues, I thought it would be good to discuss it with you. So, I mean, first, for the listeners and those who aren't as well versed on the topic, maybe you can give a little background about what it is and then how this leads to the peace treaty before we can dive into some more specifics.
Sure, and thank you for your question. So, since the establishment of both states, the establishment of the Kingdom of Jordan in 1946, the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, the two countries have a rather long history of cooperation and collaboration between them. Now, they did go to war twice during that period, in 1948, of course, in Israel's War of Independence, and in 1967, when Jordan's allies, Egypt and Syria, sort of drew them unwillingly into the Six-Day War, and as a result, they lost the old city of Jerusalem and the West Bank to Israel. However, if we look over the entire existence of the two states, we see that there was a very large degree of cooperation between the two of them. In 1958, the Israelis stepped in to save King Hussein from a coup that was being carried out by some pro-Nasserist officers. The most significant case, of course, 1970, when the PLO tried to make a coup in Jordan with the help of the Syrian army, and the Israelis actually mobilized reserve forces and sent some deterrence messaging to the Syrians to stay out, and actually saved Hussein's reign. And of course, in 1991, and this only came out recently, sort of in the other direction, in 1991, King Hussein promised Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir that Jordan would not allow Iraq to use either its airspace or its territory to attack Israel during the Gulf War. And for that reason, Israel did not respond to the rocket attacks on the Israeli civilian rear during the first Gulf War, and therefore perhaps prevented a wider escalation of the conflict. So the two countries were cooperating for a long time. They were cooperating under the radar of the populations. But then in 1993, a very significant thing happened. And the significant thing that happened, of course, was the beginning of the Oslo process. And because of the Oslo process, two things happened. On the one hand, Jordan suddenly felt that it could make a peace treaty with Israel because the Palestinians were no longer a limitation. But on the other hand, they were quite worried because the negotiations between the PLO and Israel on Oslo had been kept from the Jordanians until the very last stage. And the Jordanians were quite worried that they would be left in the lurch. For Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, who was Prime Minister of Israel at the time, it was actually much more easy for him to make peace with Jordan, with the Palestinians, because, as I said, it had been a relationship that had been not a very fraught one for a long time. And therefore, the process of moving forward that peace treaty went quite quickly. And as you said, on July 25th, 1994, the two countries went to Washington to make the Washington Declaration. And within 3 months, they had already written and signed a peace treaty, exactly 3 months later.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm curious, how those under the radar ties, basically as you laid out through beginning in 1948, was able to withstand, essentially two conflicts, the broader Arab-Israeli tensions over the Palestinian issue, and how, basically once the conditions came right, both sides were ready to go really quickly to move forward with from the Washington Declaration to the peace treaty.
So you're absolutely right. And the issue is that even after 1967, and for a while after 1967, there was quite a bit of tension. But Jordan and Israel have, for almost the entire period that they've had close relations, had, let's say, a picture of a threat picture or an interest picture, both an interest picture and a threat picture, which was always very, very similar. They were both very, very concerned. They were both very pro-Western. King Hussein, of course, was pro-Western from the beginning, first with the British and then with the Americans. They were both very status quo powers within the region and were worried about such radical movements as Nasserism or later after the Iranian Revolution. They both were quite worried and interested in cooperating on controlling the Palestinian national movement so that it wouldn't threaten the existence of either of those states, and at a certain point cooperating also against Palestinian terrorism, which was aimed almost equally, certainly in the 70s, both sides. And they sort of looked around them. They both saw Syria as a threat, and they both thought Syria as a threat. They both saw the PLO as a threat. They both saw the Americans as an ally, and they both understood that cooperating would be a lot more worthwhile for them than having a adversarial relationship. And that went on as for a very long time. And even in the two periods when, especially in 1967, 1948 was Israel's War of Independence, but even in 1967, when the two armies fought each other, fairly soon afterwards, as I said, by 1970, they were already cooperating. So the Israelis very much understood that the Jordanians had been forced into the war and didn't have the same sort of level of antipathy towards Jordan than they did towards Syria or Egypt.
Yeah, and so if we basically let's project forward. So after trying to move it up more into the present, is so that you have these historical relations, you have these sort of overlapping interests in terms of combating shared threats. How would you judge basically after the signing of the peace treaty or after the Washington Declaration that this relationship matured and then continued to move forward up until the present day?
So exactly. So I'll look back from today, and I would say that one of the interesting things about addressing this now, 25 years later, is how bad the relationships look. The relations look, as opposed, perhaps, and I'll discuss in a minute, of how good they actually are. And the reason is, I think, that both sides at this point are sort of taking it for granted. Israel has its quietest border is the border with Jordan, which is also its longest border. There has not been a successful penetration of that border from the east since before the peace treaty was signed. Israel was able to cut its military forces that it keeps on that border significantly, and basically, to a certain extent, contracted out the security of the border to a large extent to the other side. And it also extended Israeli security border all the way east, almost to the Iraqi border. In other words, because if you have a country next to you that's a de facto security ally, then you're not addressing your threats at your borders, you're addressing its threats at its borders. And of course, the Jordanians, what they got from Israel was the protection of the regional military superpower. And during different periods, certainly during the Syrian civil war, but also long before that, it was very significant for them. And also one thing that that's important to remember, and a little bit later, maybe we'll discuss the economic problems of relationships. One of the things that it did do is by signing the relationship in 1994, Jordan erased all its debts with the United States. The United States then went to all the international monetary organizations and asked them to lend money to Jordan. And Jordan's exports and in general, Jordan's economy has increased 4 or 6 times from 1994 until now. So while there aren't direct bilateral economic benefits, the overall economic benefits of being at peace with Israel were enormous for Jordan.
And I'm curious how that then begins to be contextualized within Israeli domestic politics. So, I mean, between, I guess we've had 2 instances of Bibi overseeing sort of the management of this relationship. So yes. I'm curious maybe how it compared back then, in the 1990s versus, the current domestic political environment in Israel and, as we march towards new elections.
So it's a great question. I have the feeling the Jordanians are not enamored of Prime Minister Netanyahu. The peace treaty was signed in 1994 by Yitzhak Rabin. Yitzhak Rabin was murdered in 1995. In 1996, in the elections following his assassination, Bibi Netanyahu was elected, and he served from 1996 till 2000. And that was actually a very bad period for the relations. Israel carried out a lot of steps in the West Bank and in Jerusalem that the Jordanians were very unhappy with, and felt that the Israelis were not taking their interests into consideration, and therefore were carrying out activities that were then causing unrest within Jordan itself. And of course, in 1997, the Israeli government attempted to assassinate Khaled Mashal, the head of the political leadership of Hamas, in Amman, which caused a serious breach. And this is only 3 years after the peace treaty was signed. So let's say there were perhaps high hopes, perhaps too high hopes, in 1994, and starting from 1996 and 1996, 1997, 1998, sort of one after the other, there were some very high-profile, let's say, frictions in the relationship. And these frictions have basically continued all along, while the security relationship is excellent and keeps on getting better. And I think that each country is one of the other's main security allies and main security interlocutors. The cooperation is very broad and very deep, very, very significant. And by the way, the cooperation between them then enables them to cooperate with third parties, such as the United States, in a effective fashion as well. But politically, the party or the camp that Netanyahu heads is not enamored of the peace treaty with Jordan. And I think one of the interesting things you see in recent weeks is Netanyahu is making a real effort to sort of prove his foreign policy chops. He has this new campaign where he shows pictures of him with Trump and him with Prime Minister Modi of India and him with Vladimir Putin, but he never shows pictures of himself with the Jordanian king. And I think I was thinking about that recently. I think part of the reason is his base is not very happy with the peace treaty with Jordan. Part of his base thinks that Jordan shouldn't be a state.
I mean, I want to get back to how this relates to the U.S. like in a few minutes. So I'm going to circle back to that, but I'm curious why the base would be, sort of hostile to this. I mean, is it given that, as you said earlier, that it is Israel's its longest and quietest border, and then maybe extrapolate from that, how the Jerusalem issue, and I know that touches on the United States, sort of impacts the bilateral relationship.
So I would say there are three reasons why the Israeli right wing is not crazy about Jordan. The first is, and sort of the bedrock one, and maybe the least significant one right now, is that the right wing in Israeli politics has always denied the existence of a state called Jordan. They think Jordan's an artificial state, was set up by the British in 1922 to take part of the mandate of Palestine away. And from their point of view, Jordan is Palestine. And that's where the Palestinian problem should be solved. Now, this is sort of a subterranean trend in Israeli right-wing politics, but it's something that the Jordanians are very, very aware of. And one of the reasons they went to the peace treaty was to sort of kill off this idea. And every time this idea does come up, sort of on the fringes of Israeli politics, they respond very, very strongly. I would say the second reason is, and this is a sort of a broader thing, it's true of Egypt as well, the peace is a peace between governments. It's a peace that, as I said, is a very important security component, but it's not a peace between peoples. When you look at the components of what normal relations look like between two countries, they don't really exist between Israel and Jordan. Israeli tourists do go to Jordan, but the Jordanians don't like them very much. The Jordanian political system, the opposition or the parliament, which aren't that important as political actors, but are as important to sort of bywethers of public opinion, is strongly anti-Israel. And as I said, and on the fringes, sort of shades sometimes into anti-Semitism. And they sort of say, well, if we're at peace with this country for 25 years, why aren't we friends with them? Why are they still condemning our actions in the territories? Why are they still supporting the Palestinians? Why aren't they sort of greeting us with open arms? And Israelis I think there's a certain disappointment in Israel because I think the peace treaty might have been oversold at the beginning as sort of this will now be a peace of peoples. And now it isn't that. In other words, it's a very important component of Israeli national security. I'm not sure everybody in Israel realizes how important a component it is, and it's provided tremendous benefits over the past 25 years. But it's certainly not a warm relationship. And I think a lot of Israelis are surprised by that or resent that. And then when there are various tensions within the relations, so and we'll come to Jerusalem in a second, but Jerusalem, of course, the main place where this is. So they say, well, why do we have this relationship? We're not getting anything from it. In other words, they act in a lot of ways. The Jordanians act in a lot of ways as if they are still a hostile country. And I think part of that is sort of either a misunderstanding or a willful sort of ignorance of the domestic complexity of Jordan, and what are the challenges that the Jordanian leadership faces in both maintaining the peace treaty and maintaining public decorum, where, as I said, the people are not necessarily for the peace treaty. And as I say, there are certain issues that sort of pop up. Jerusalem is the main among them, but there are others which sort of put it right out there in the front so that both sides take a careful look at the nature of the relationship and don't necessarily like what they see.
Yeah, and then can you touch a little bit on the Jerusalem issue, and then we're going to circle back to why it matters for the U.S. and the role of the Trump administration, the Bahrain conference, and sort of like where this was going.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. So the Jerusalem issue is as they say, Jerusalem is supposedly the most complex issue. It's actually not that complex. The peace treaty says that the peace treaty specifically says that it will take into account the special position of Jordan regarding it will give high priority to the Jordanian historic role in the Muslim holy shrines in Jerusalem. That's what it says. Now, the Jordanians have over the years, and King Abdallah especially, since he came into power, have sort of parlayed this recognition, a special role of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan in Muslim holy shrines to a position of the protector of Christian and Muslim shrines in Jerusalem. So basically, you have the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount is the most important place in the world for Jews, all Jews in the world, to pray towards the Temple Mount. And the Temple Mount is in fact controlled by the Jordanian Waqf, the Jordanian Religious Affairs Ministry. And that's how Israel decided to do it in 1967. And they decided that by letting Jews freely onto the Temple Mount would cause an uproar in the Muslim world. So they agreed to leave the Jordanian-controlled Waqf in control. And the Jordanians have kept that control over time. And as I said, have sort of expanded their view of their mission farther than that. In other words, not only the places in Jerusalem, but sometimes placed outside Jerusalem. Not only the Muslim holy places, sometimes even the Christian holy places. And when there is tension in Israeli-Palestinian relations, it tends to find its expression very, very often on the Temple Mount. And then what ends up happening is that means that Jordan gets drawn into these tensions on the Temple Mount sort of automatically because of their role that they were both given and the more expanded role that they have taken, and therefore end up in what I call sort of an escalation spiral. They get pulled into things that they didn't necessarily want to get pulled in, but then they have to take a position which is in keeping with their self-image as the protector of the Muslims on Muslim rights on the Temple Mount. And then you end up having this kind of tension between Israel, who wants to enforce its sovereignty on the not necessarily, by the way, let Jews up there to pray freely, but wants to enforce its sovereignty because the situation there is quite complex, that Israel is sovereign there, but somebody else is running it, and the Jordanian need to be seen as protecting Muslim rights on the Temple Mount. And that comes and goes often. And it came up recently in March. There was unrest on regarding the Gate of Mercy, the opening of a new mosque, and the Israeli courts closed it down. And that sort of has quieted down because it's been moved to the security channel to sort of be discussed. And the security channel, it exists not only as a very effective channel for security cooperation, but also as a sort of discrete channel where some of these more political and difficult pressures can be handled far from prying eyes. And that apparently is what's going on now. So the Jordanians understand that this is a hot issue, but they can't sort of pull back anymore than their current role is, because, and this feeds into the issue that you wanted to ask me, because other players, the Turks and Hamas and the Saudis, would like to have a larger role on the Temple Mount. And therefore, if they're going in, if they want to get into the Temple Mount, and Israel is not going to give up any of its role, then the role that they are trying to get is going to be at the expense of Jordan. And because the control and the role of protector of the holy places in Jerusalem is a key part of the religious legitimacy of the Hashemites in Jordan, then they can't let this happen. In other words, so they need to be the strictest on protecting Muslim rights on the Temple Mount, because otherwise other players could come in and begin to eat away at their role there. And that has a domestic cost, or could have a domestic legitimacy cost as well.
So that leads us to the sort of the final sort of like block of the podcast here, which is, clearly with the election of President Trump, you've had a more sort of like, I guess, assertive American policy, if that says, beginning with the move of the embassy, so the formal move of the embassy, and then sort of, I'd say the most recent thing is the workshop in Bahrain, and then the long rumored sort of deal of the century.
Right.
Let's bring the U.S. into this, and where American politics are influencing this issue, and then how that like ultimately links between these, the Israelis and the Jordanians and their relations 25 years after the treaty.
Okay, great. So I'll step back for a moment, and then I'll be right up to today. So as I said, the Americans were a key interlocutor in the process that brought peace between Jordan and Israel. But by the way, they were key, but they weren't major. The two sides really reached it themselves, and their security cooperation and other cooperation since then has been carried out, a lot of it bilaterally. A lot of times the Americans have come in, to provide money, the Americans have come in to provide expertise, the Americans have come in to maybe arm wrestle a little bit the two governments to make sure that they're on the right side. But it's really a relationship that's quite bilateral. And what's happened is, as I said, the issues that are the most difficult, the Palestinian issue is the most difficult for the relationship, but it's also the basis of the relationship. And there's Jordan and Israel went into a relationship because they both have an interest that the Palestinian issue not get out of hand. Israel sees Jordan as sort of the doorman who protects the West Bank from bad influences, and Jordan sees Israel as the I'm not going to say sovereign, the de facto ruler of the territories, and therefore that the better Israel's rule is in the territories, the less that Jordan is going to be worried about Palestinians fleeing to Jordan, or about the Palestinians or Jordans of Palestinian origin being unhappy and there being unrest among them. What happened under this administration is, as I said, as you so rightly said, there was a lot of ambiguity, or let's say, yes, there's a lot of ambiguity about the American position on Jerusalem and the American position on the territories. And what's happened since Trump came into office is that a lot of that ambiguity has gone away. And that has then forced the Jordanians, who are a close ally of the United States, it's sort of forced them to take positions which are against the American position. In the past, it didn't have to do that so much because the Americans were vague. And now that the Jordanians had to condemn the moving of the American embassy, right? They might not have wanted to, because it certainly isn't good for their relationship with the United States. But from an inter-Arab point of view and from an internal point of view, they couldn't get away with not doing that. In the same way, when the economic component of the Trump plan came about, it was seen by the Palestinians as something that was trying to exclude them. The whole process was seen as a process that was sort of solving the Palestinian problem without the Palestinians. Then the Jordanians had to take a much firmer position than some of the other Arab states did, because Jordan is right next to Palestine, and for better or for worse, their politics and their futures are and their pasts are intrinsically linked. So the Jordanians sort of have to stay on the side of Palestinians, and the more that the American government sort of restricts the area of ambiguity, the more the Jordanians are going to end up being in criticism or in conflict of American policy. Now, the Jordanians have complained, for instance, that in Jared Kushner's visits and in the preparation of the he's, by the way, going to visit apparently Jordan this week, but that up until now, in all of his talks with the Saudis and with the Emiratis and with the Bahrainis and with the Israelis, he hasn't been talking to Jordanians. And the Jordanians keep on hearing about ideas that have come up or promises that have been made. For instance, the promise that supposedly was made to give the Saudis a role on the Temple Mount, which go against Jordanian interests. The Jordanians are saying, okay, the Americans and the Israelis are talking between themselves, and they're talking with the Gulf states, and no one's watching out for our interests. So we have to stand up for our interests, but we know that there's going to be a price for that, because of course, if once the Americans put forward sort of the political component of the Trump-Kushner plan, the Jordanians are probably going to have to reject it. And under this administration in the United States and with this White House, that could cost them significantly. The need to take a position that is going to be in opposition to that of the American government is something that could cost Jordan, which is a country which is very, very dependent on foreign assistance and very dependent on its relationship with the United States and Saudi Arabia and the UAE. It could cost them a lot.
These are complicated issues. I mean, is there any final words you want to say before we wrap up here?
Yeah, my final word is really, it's more about Israelis, but I'll try to make it relevant to Americans as well. So the peace treaty has worked really, really well for 25 years. And it's worked well because it's given the two countries what they needed, where they wanted, where they really needed it. And the cooperation has been fairly kept from sort of fairly underexposed. And that's worked out great. But part of the problem is that after 25 years, I think all three parties, the Israelis certainly, I think the Americans, sort of take it for granted. And while somebody recently sort of pointed out to me, they said, well, Israel has this sort of wife, which is Jordan, for a long time, and now is sort of flirting with mistresses in the Gulf. And sort of, from the Jordanian point of view, the Israeli adventurism in the Gulf and the Israeli sort of, the Israeli government doing as much as it can to sort of cement with Trump all sorts of things that in the past it couldn't get from American governments, are things that are quite worrying to Jordanians. And unless the Israelis both understand that the significance of relationship with the Jordanians, and at least as importantly, reflect to their people how important these relationships are, and that because these relationships are so important, sometimes you have to take Jordanian interests into consideration. I think that there could be some Jordanian moves to sort of make it clear to Israel what the price could be if the relationships got worse.
With that, Josh, I appreciate you coming on and explaining this and going into a lot of depth about this. It's clearly an issue and something that we look forward to you writing about here at FPRI and also with other outlets, and discussing further as things come up. So I appreciate you coming on.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody, for listening.